You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now it is time for our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight, and that means we bring in Erica L. Ayala. And Erica, busy time right now in women's hockey, rosters getting set. What are your key observations from the PWHL's final rosters?
For sure. So we knew this was coming. We talked last time on the Women's Hockey Spotlight about the Utica Evaluation Camp. Now, there were rosters for those camps so that each team knew who was coming from other teams. And it was a chance to make the final roster of the camp you'd been invited to, but also an opportunity maybe to swap out for a better fit. And I was talking with a good colleague of mine, Angelica Rodriguez. We also saw that some players were able to restructure the terms of their existing contract after the eval camp. So from a pro-union side of things, I think the CBA kind of doing what it needed to do. The evaluation camp actually not officially in the CBA or anything we knew was going to be happening, but I love that players had the opportunity to put their skills on display in a competition setting, and then that yielded either longer terms or higher pay for certain athletes. Corrine Schroeder being among them. But we also saw some players, as I alluded to, find a fit on a different team. So it's 6 teams. The rosters are 26 players, and 23 of those players are considered under the standard player agreement. And then there are 3 players, up to 3 players per team, that are considered reserve players or reserve player contracts. So we've seen this before in women's hockey. They were called practice players. I think a lot of people in the hockey community or even in men's basketball are familiar with like 2-way contracts or kind of a taxi squad that we saw, especially during the COVID years. So it's something along those lines. And what's interesting about these players is that they're not just, although they're held on one team's roster, the working understanding, especially because I believe right now we only have one goalie as a reserve player, but that goalie in particular could be accessible to all 6 teams. So that's a little interesting. But overall, we see that Canada has the most players in the PWHL with a count of 90. No surprise, I think, to many that the United States right behind that. But I did think that the number, 90 players from Canada, 53 from the United States. So that's interesting. And then we have 14 other nations that are represented. The big ones that we expect: Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, but also Hungary, Japan, Germany, Czechia, and Austria. So I think overall, not too many surprises. If anything, I think there are some players that are reserves who maybe we thought, certainly from a talent perspective, could be mainstays on the roster. One person that stands out to me is Claire Thompson. Now, she plays in the Canadian national team system, we believe, because this was never officially reported, but my understanding is that she was granted a compassionate circumstance waiver to be in the New York market. And that is because she is in school at NYU while continuing her national team commitments and trying to play in the PWHL. But she is a reserve. She was a camp invite and is now a reserve player for PWHL New York. Alexa Grushow, also a reserve for PWHL New York. She played with the Riveters, helped them win, got the only goal in their championship game in the Isabel Cup in 2018, and then decided to go over to the PWHPA and had been a mainstay there kind of a glue player for a lot of those teams. So that's interesting to see. We talked before about players like Madison Packer. She also was granted a compassionate circumstance waiver. She did not get the terms or maybe even the contract, from my understanding, that she was hoping for. So she decided to waive her compassionate waiver circumstance, go into the draft as a free agent. She was invited to New York camp. And made the roster. So,
Right.
overall, I think that I like what Ottawa and Montreal have done. I think if you look at their rosters on paper, they really looked at what kind of game they wanted to play, and then regardless of past experience, current affiliation to a national team or not, I think they really built a great roster. For Ottawa, they're going to have Fanny Garat-Gasparix, Emily Clark, Brianne Jenner, Katarzyna Mrazova, and Michaela Grant-Mentis as a few of their forwards, which just sounds ridiculously insane to me. Only if it were not for what Montreal has, which is Marie-Philippe Poulin, Anne-Sophie Betty, and Jillian Dempsey, all on the same squad.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of the ratio to drafted players to camp invites? Because it seems like, you look at who got drafted and there's a lot of camp invites that got these final roster spots.
Yeah, so I think overall there are a few different things that play into that. I mean, the draft was, I'm forgetting how many rounds. I want to say 4 or 5 rounds, something along those lines. And so there are a limited amount of draft picks that you're going to have. And I did find it interesting that the draft picks were kind of used on players, I would say, like even a Natalie Spooner, who or a Jocelyn Larocque, who I think a team could have probably easily just signed in free agency, but opted to use a draft pick on those players. So, when we look at how many draft picks versus how many people come from camp invites, I think some of it I'm not really sure right now, if I'm being honest, how to evaluate that. But just because the draft itself, I think, was not even with a compassionate circumstance waiver, I'm not really sure that every team had the same strategy when it came to the draft. So that's number one. But also when it comes to when it comes to camp invites, I think Boston stuck pretty much to their players that they drafted. I mean, if you look at the front end, Gigi Marvin, who is a name that, a lot of people will probably know, but she's one of the players that comes in as a camp invite. She hadn't played competitive hockey in a really long time, comes in as a camp invite along with Taylor Wenskowski. But for the most part, Boston has a roster where they are pretty much operating through the draft. Now it's a little bit different with Minnesota, and it's fair to say also with Minnesota that they've had some injuries. So Sydney Brote, Sydney Brote, one of those players that has been injured. I mentioned Madison Packer; she's been injured as well. So some of that also affected whether we saw draft picks versus camp invites. And then I think also the reserve player, and just knowing that there are also people that have withdrawn their name for one reason or another. We talked about Soroya Tinker. I mentioned Claire Thompson is still going to be a reserve player, but will not necessarily have the time commitment in theory that some of the other players have. And I think we've also seen that some players that have been drafted, even that have been signed, have had to make different arrangements. So it's hard to say right now what the weight of that is, because so many of these players, whether they were drafted or signed in free agency or invited to camp, they have championships. They have national team experience. It's really just a matter of what was the right fit at the right time, knowing that this was a short runway for the PWHL.
We are getting very close to the start of play for this league. What still has to happen between now and puck drop, which is just a few weeks away?
Great question. We know that the schedule is officially released. We've talked about that a little bit before. The venues are all secured for the most part. Season tickets, places like Toronto have been selling out. So that's great to see. What we don't know is if you're not at the game, how can you watch the game? And that is something that we've been promised will be coming. I know that there is a goal to have these on broadcast TV. However, the very next comment from Stan Kasten after that was, but at a minimum, they will be streamed. If I were a betting woman, which I am not, but if FanDuel had a betting line on that, I would probably say that they're going to be closer on the streaming side, especially for puck drop January 1. Maybe they have a one-time deal that they can do with an NHL network or likely with a Canadian outlet. But I think the majority of the games we'll see will be available through some kind of streaming service. We've seen it all. We've seen Twitch. We've seen YouTube. We've even seen, I think at one time it was ABC News streaming an Isabel Cup final. So we've seen a lot of different iterations in women's hockey. So that's the top of the list. Also, what is the merchandise and things that fans are going to be wearing to games? We know that they've opted not to do individual logos, but I'm sure people still want to spend their money. This is a historic time in women's hockey. We saw fans get very creative with how they wanted to represent the team that they're going to be rooting for when they had the Fan Fest in Utica. But I think there also are some things on the back end that, as a member of the Professional Hockey Writers Association and heading the women's hockey chapter, we're also looking for that continuity when it comes to things that are available for media, making sure we have game notes and projected lines and that we have reliable statistics. Unfortunately, we've already seen that the stats, people on social media seeing clips have noted that an assist was given to a player that never touched the puck. So these are things that are still part of the growing pains, unfortunately, of women's hockey, but hopefully that the PWHL can shore up, if not by the time the puck drops, shortly into their inaugural season.
And finally, today, the Rivalry Series between USA and Canada is just chugging along in the background of all this. We saw an overtime winner from Hillary Knight in one of those games. Where are we at in the Rivalry Series overall?
Well, I mean, much, I'm sure, to the disappointment of Canadian fans, USA has been dominating the Rivalry Series, which, you know, we tend to see that one team will dominate one part of the leg and then it evens itself out. We've also seen Canada struggle a little bit early on in the Rivalry Series and then come back and get some wins. But right now it's looking really good for the United States. I do think it's fair to say that after Beijing, they made some changes, particularly to their coaching staff. They've started practicing special teams for tournaments.
Shocker.
I know, like, special teams are important in short-term, high-stakes tournaments. Who knew? But and Erin Frankel, I know we've talked about Erin Frankel a time or two, Rachel, but she's been getting a lot more playing time with the United States. And I think that it's been a given that the US would dominate offensively. And if we're being honest, I think defense and goaltending sometimes fell into place second and third, which is so funny to say when you're playing a team like Team Canada, and again, the aforementioned Marie-Philippe Poulin, Sarah Nurse, Brianne Jenner. But I think they've relied a lot on kind of their American style, just kind of physical game a lot, where this team seems a little bit more focused in all three zones. I've mentioned before Hillary Knight, who got the OT game winner. I see her making plays in open ice. You know, you can't do open ice hits in women's hockey at the IHF level, but making things more difficult for the opposition, finding ways to win back pucks for her team. So, you know, she's such a player that goes north, is just kind of driving and crashing to the net, thought of as a goal scorer first, but she has really committed in other areas, and so has Marie-Philippe Poulin. And I think some of that is also opening up space for some younger talent to come in and to kind of be the showstoppers. But I love that you're still almost always guaranteed, if not both, that either one, Marie-Philippe Poulin or Hilary Knight will score in a rivalry series.
That is true. And you can see Erin Frankel, who you mentioned, and Hilary Knight on Boston in the PWHL coming up. So that should be fun.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. And that's another great thing. Just seeing that teammates are now foes when it comes to the national team.
Always love that in tournaments like that. So a little extra twist for some players and fans there. Erica, thank you so much. We're looking forward to having you back in 2 weeks when we will be right up against the start of the first season of the PWHL. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both, and we'll chat soon.